Hello, America, and to our friends around the world, greetings, welcome back. If you're anything like I am, when you are reading or listening or watching popular media, in particular science fiction, fantasy, you look at what it is that inspired the creation, what its real world counterpart could have been. And in the universe of Star Trek, the human-led Federation has often been described as the United Nations in space. At least that's what I heard, from friends and others growing up. And as time went by, they introduced the various editions. The movie, the animated series, the movies, and then Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and I like many of you, forget about the rest. But nothing. The older I got, the United Nations correlation never sat right with me. The reason the United Nations doesn't sit right with me as being, you know, the Federation stand-in, the United Nations allows any nation to participate. That's dictatorships. That's oppressive regimes. I mean, we've all seen it, we've all heard it, and that is, for what reason is this person sitting representing this nation with its history of fill in the blank? Whether it was the Soviet Union, whether it was China, whether it was any other nation that had a history of oppression, genocide, eradication of civil rights, whatever it is, that people were abused, but they were allowed to participate and have full voting rights within the United Nations. The Federation doesn't do that. In fact, if you go back to Deep Space Nine, there was an episode where an individual who had been lost in time comes out of the wormhole, and Cisco gives up the role of being emissary to this individual, who then decides to start implementing the caste system. And Cisco stated, if Bajor institutes a caste system, they would be ineligible for Federation membership. Which tells you that the Federation has criteria to allow certain bodies, certain planetary bodies, to be admitted. One of them is that they can't have a caste system. The other one is no matter the alliance, the Klingons were never invited to join, and so goes with the other empires, the Cardassians and, obviously the Romulans. That's just never going to happen. Well, maybe not never. I mean, something could happen in the future. But more to the point, what was it that was introduced in the original series in Balance of Terror? Was the neutral zone, a buffer between the Romulan Star Empire and the Federation after a devastating war known as the Earth-Romulan War. And what was the result of the Earth-Romulan War? The creation of the Federation, an alliance of planets that made it so that if one was attacked, all were attacked, and they would share their technology and their resources in order to protect one another. Star Trek's Federation, having come out of a war, created not a space United Nations, but a space NATO. If you look at the storylines from the television series and the movies, you'll find that the NATO analogy is more accurate, in my opinion, than the United Nations. And the reason is, number one, America is humanity. It represented what was considered at the time the best of us. It was the best of capitalism. It was the best of science. It was the best of exploration. It was the best of politics. It was on the heels of John Kennedy It was on the heels of success in both the Korean War and World War II, feeling that it was our efforts that liberated the world from imperial and nightmarish regimes out of Europe and Asia. Whether that's accurate or not, leave that to the scholars. And in Star Trek, you had humanity leading a coalition against Romulan aggression, as demonstrated with Enterprise. Around the 3.5 minute mark of the video is the image of the neutral zone, which separated the Romulan Empire from humanity and later the Federation. And now you're looking at a map of Europe that shows essentially NATO on the west, or in the west, and those of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc nations, the satellite nations of the former Soviet Union. This was designated the Iron Curtain. It wasn't called a neutral zone, but that's in essence what it was. It was a political divide between East and West. Where this became physical was in Berlin. Berlin was in the eastern part of Germany, which was controlled by the Soviets. And Berlin itself was controlled by four political powers: the Soviet Union, America, France, and Great Britain. Great Britain, France, and America allowed West Berlin to become West Berlin, and in retaliation, and because of people escaping communism via West Berlin, the Berlin Wall was created, a literal, physical barrier separating the two. In Star Trek, the Federation is a governing body that trades technology and resources. And you see this in the original series with the development of Sherman's planet, that whoever would be able to develop that planet better between Federation and the Klingons would eventually have political control over it. So the Federation is about trade, trading this technology for this resource, and vice versa, and so on. It's also about force projection. Bajor, for example, invited the Federation to help them manage the space station, Deep Space Nine, after the Cardassians withdrew. This is force projection. A government goes in the case of the Federation, to Bajor to manage Deep Space Nine, or America, and sets up military bases throughout Europe, implementing the Marshall Plan, and later, being the foundation to NATO. Now, don't mistake what I'm saying. NATO is not part of the Marshall Plan. They are two separate things, but they are loosely connected in the sense of being a wall against communist expansion into Europe. But the NATO alliance has a non-aggression pact and mutual protection pact. In the news over the last couple of years, there's been the Article 5 reference that if one member nation is attacked, all member nations will come to that nation's aid, similar with the Federation. When the Dominion took over, Beta Z, the Federation reeled because they failed to protect it, because the fleet was doing exercises somewhere else rather than doing their sentry duty to protect the planet, as well as the defense systems were out of date. So the other part of it is non-interference. The Federation has the prime directive. American force projection, at least when I was in the military, was if you screw up in the community, don't think that running back to the base is going to protect you. meaning that you're subject to the local laws and jurisdictions of where it is that you're stationed. Uh, Whether or not this is uniformly followed, I don't know. I just know that the base orientation, that's one of the things that they said, is don't be a jerk, follow the local laws and customs. So each jurisdiction, each planetary body, or in the case of NATO, each nation has its own currency, its own laws, its um, own customs, own laws, own currency. But they do have trade agreements, they do have protection agreements, and they have non-aggression agreements. Very much the same as the Federation and its member worlds. They're not, Earth and Vulcan aren't going to attack each other. They're just going to trade resources, technology, and so forth. But they're going to maintain their sovereignty to a certain point. And you may be thinking, well, the United Nations is the same way. Those nations also, have alliances with, each other, and they have their own customs, their own laws, their own currencies, and so forth, and they do trade. But there is a restrictive element to NATO that is more akin to the Federation than the United Nations is to the Federation, and that is NATO member states typically are democratic republics. They have representative governments. They elect their leaders, and they have, mostly parliamentary government structures, whereas the United Nations allows dictatorships and other oppressive regimes to have full membership rights, voting rights, and allowed to sit on such questionable committees as human rights. So the concept of a nation that is historically violating human rights is allowed to set policy. And that's something that supposedly doesn't happen with NATO and doesn't happen supposedly with the Federation. So those are my big reasons that I suspect that the United Nations is not a space federation, or the Federation isn't a space United Nations, but rather Star Trek's Federation, being led by humanity, is more a space NATO, akin to our NATO being led by America.